Maine and committee members, my name is Winston Tapton, and before I get started with my remarks, I'm going to bring some realism to marijuana use. And thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today and relate my perspective on legalization of recreational marijuana. It is my intent to only relate 3 incidents that illustrate the complexity of marijuana in our society and its effect on correctional institutions. Over the 14 years I spent in the administration of the penitentiary, there were numerous incidents that involved marijuana, consumption, smuggling, selling, that complicated the functioning of the institution. My professional background lends to a distinctive view on the effects of marijuana usage on our citizens. I began my career while I attended Minot State College, working as a dorm counselor at Dakota Boys Ranch. After graduating from the University of Minnesota, I returned to North Dakota and was employed by the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation as a pre-release counselor at the penitentiary. At the age of 30, I was appointed deputy warden. 7 years later, I was appointed warden and held that position until 1986. I then became the director of Home on the Range, a children's residential facility in western North Dakota for the next 11 years. I worked for a total of 30 years with adults and youth who were not successfully functioning in society. Today, it is my purpose to give you my perspective on individuals who became incarcerated or placed for crimes related to the use or selling of marijuana or other drugs. My outlook is based on realistic events during my tenure as deputy warden and warden. The most common denominator to these events was marijuana. I became deputy warden in 1972. At the time, the first individuals were incarcerated for selling marijuana. This group of individuals changed the dynamics within the prison. Smuggling became a constant task, and we worked 365 days a year to prevent the entry of hallucinogenic substances. The history of combating illicit substances affected inmates and staff alike. Today, I'm going to only focus on 3 incidents that convey the burden placed on the functioning of the prison. The demand for marijuana by inmates was overwhelming, and every avenue was used to circumvent security measures. This demand had a devastating effect on individual inmates. The first incident I want to relate to you concerns a 19-year-old who was incarcerated for his second term in prison. He was an immature, good-natured, sociable young man who was not focused on the obligations of becoming an adult. He purchased $15 worth of smuggled marijuana from a group of inmates who portrayed themselves as thugs and enforcers. He could not come up with the money he owed them. They began to pressure him and physically assaulted him to force payment. This young man was involved in our educational classes in order to obtain a GED certificate. The GED classes were held in the education rooms adjacent to the gymnasium. During class, he asked the instructor to go to the bathroom. He was granted permission. He did not return to the class, and the teacher went and asked the recreation director to look for him. The rec director began to search the building, check the weight room, and adjacent to the weight room was a room with punching bags. When he opened the door, he found the young man hanging from a hook that supported the heavy punching bag. After the investigation by the Burleigh County Sheriff's Department was concluded, I asked the correctional officers to search the young man's cell. They brought me a sealed envelope that had the father's name and mine on it. I opened the envelope. The inmate apologized to his father for underachieving in everything he attempted in life and being a burden to his father. He was sorry for being a failure. The second half of the letter was to me. He explained that he could not live up to my expectations that inmates take advantage of the programs we offered in order to change their lives. To this day, I wonder about the words I used to inspire inmates to use the tools we had to assist them to change their lives. Should I have recognized the vulnerability of certain individuals? Could I have chosen my words more wisely? I will never know. The only aspect of this event is that there was one common denominator: marijuana. The second occurrence involved a correctional officer who was 1 year from retirement. He was persuaded into smuggling in marijuana into the prison. After a year of investigation by our staff and the Crime Bureau, we determined a method of smuggling. We then began to plan on how to apprehend the officer. Prior to the discovery of the officer's involvement, I became aware that his son was in the state hospital treatment unit for drug addiction. The officer would attend weekly therapy sessions for his son. After attending one session, a therapist called me and related that she thought the officer was so depressed that he was suicidal. I called the officer into my office and talked to him about his mental health. When I asked him if he was depressed, he acknowledged that he was. I then asked him if I could set up an appointment for him with a psychologist, and he agreed. As the investigation began to focus on the apprehension of the officer, I called the psychologist and informed him of the impending arrest. I requested his services after the arrest took place. He agreed, and after lengthening questions of the officer, I transported the officer to the doctor's office at 8 p.m. in the evening. Due to circumstances, the officer was not charged, but I terminated his employment. His wife came to see me and vented her anger against my decision. This, unfortunately, did not end the incident. One of the local television station's news director called me and demanded that I give him the name of the officer. I refused. The discussion became heated, and I became angry. He slammed the phone down. I thought that was the end of the incident. The next morning, I was called to Governor Olson's office, and when I opened the door, I observed several people seated around the table. I recall thinking, this does not look good. The governor's administrator, his attorney, an attorney from the AG's office, and the chairman of the Republican Party were waiting for me. I related the same story I just related to you. I informed them I would not disclose the name of the officer to the news media, nor would I give them the name of the officer due to his mental health circumstances. The meeting ended, and I never had to answer another inquiry. The most common denominator to this series of events was marijuana. The last account I want to relate to you is a group of young men engaged in crime activity in the Fargo area. They called themselves the Black Orchids. They used, sold drugs, and committed property crimes. We became aware of this group when the first member was sentenced to the penitentiary. In total, 5 of these young men came to prison for criminal offenses. The first young man who was sentenced was in prison for 17 days when he hanged himself. He was discovered hanging in his cell by an officer making his rounds just before the population was returning from afternoon recreation. Word quickly spread, and an allegation was made that the officer did not respond quickly enough, and the inmate's life could have been saved. As a result of this false story, we came close to having a major disturbance. After the sheriff's investigation, the officer searched the inmate's cell and brought me a long, rambling 6-page written testimony as to why the inmate was going to kill himself. As I read the document, I was confused by the language and rationale. The young man was obviously mentally ill and was also a satanic worshiper, and his writings were filled with messages. He interpreted that he was directed by the devil to kill himself. The irony of this event was that a member of the same gang was a patient at the state hospital. He tried to hang himself on the same afternoon, but they were able to cut him down and revive him. Another inmate of that same group was incarcerated at the prison, and at 2:30 a.m. one night, an officer who was making his routine rounds discovered the inmate's blood-stained pillow. He had cut the right side of his neck and nicked the jugular vein. I drove the inmate to the hospital and surgery was performed, which saved his life. He was extremely depressed, and we placed him in our infirmary for constant surveillance. Also members of this gang were 2 brothers who worked in our prison industries. Those working in the industries were able to earn significantly more money than other work positions. They would request to have their money sent to their grandparents, then ask them to cash the check and give it to a man that they owed money. This money was then used to buy marijuana to be smuggled into the prison. The common denominator to all of these disrupting events was marijuana. In summary, I recognize that our citizens will be deciding on the legalization of recreational marijuana. It is my concern that they know the impact that will have on the courts, institutions, schools, colleges, taxpayers, and more importantly, families and loved ones who are impacted with addictions, lethargic behavior, brain dysfunction, and mental illness. Thank you for allowing me to appear before you today and relate only a small portion of my experiences.
Questions for Mr. Satron? Representative Vetter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Satron, I don't know, as I was listening to you and going through your testimony, I failed to see this common denominator. I mean, you used 3 examples. You had one example, it seemed to me, had more to do with protection and supervision than had to do with marijuana. You mentioned one instance of marijuana. The second incident, it sounded like the guy had a lack of integrity. If he's, what's the difference if he would have been smuggling marijuana or smuggling cocaine or smuggling anything? The guy had a lack of integrity. He could have been smuggling anything with contraband. The third case was a clear case of mental disease. I just don't see how you're relating this. It's like you go through this different stuff and then you just say, but it had to be marijuana. I just fail to see the common denominator. So how do you justify tying all this stuff together when there really is no clear denominator?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Vetter, I would like to take each one of these cases separately. The first young man, he probably would not have committed suicide if he wouldn't have bought the illegal marijuana and was bullied. That was I knew the kid well. He was a good-natured kid. He just couldn't stand up to pressure, and the pressure came from the purchase of marijuana. I must add to that, he tried to get the money from his father on numerous occasions, and his father said, no, I'm not going to give you any more money. And after he committed suicide, the father called me for 3 years after his suicide and asked me, should I have given him the money? So from his father's perspective and my perspective, it was marijuana. The second case about the officer's integrity, he had worked there for years and years and years. At that time, pay for correctional officers was extremely low. And he was tempted by supplementing his income. The only thing he didn't know is when they talked to him the first time, they recorded it. They paid him the first amount of money, and they never had to pay him again because they had the recording of him agreeing to smuggle in marijuana. The third one is, I thought about that for a long, long time, and then I started to read about marijuana addiction and the high rate of schizophrenia that comes along with addicted people. I'm not a physician, but this fellow had every symptom of schizophrenia. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think for the most part, I think that answers my question.